me today, I have award-winning author Yann Martel. Obviously, I mean virtually, this is a screen, we're in different countries, but to all intents and purposes, he's here. Yann is the man behind Life of Pi, which you may well have heard of. Perhaps like me, you even have a copy on your bookshelf. So Yann, thank you so much for speaking to me today. We're very keen to find out all about your experience with language and travel and how that's fed into your experience with writing, so that we can share your story with people all over the world who are learning English. So let's start by talking about your upbringing in different countries, because you currently live in Canada, but I believe you were actually born in Spain, and in between have lived in multiple different places. So which countries did you live in growing up?
Well, as you said, I was born in Spain. My parents were students at that time. My father was doing a doctorate and my mother was with him. She was also studying. And so I was born in Salamanca in western Spain. But we moved nearly right away. Right away, we moved to Portugal when I was at 2 weeks old. And then when I was about 3 or 4 months old, we moved to Alaska where my father started teaching. So throughout my childhood, my parents had a peripatetic existence. They moved from country to country, which means moving into different linguistic worlds. So at home, I have always spoken French to my parents, always. They're from Quebec, from the French-speaking part of Canada. They grew up in French, they studied in French, except when they were in Spain, when they were obviously studying in Spanish. And so when they speak English, they speak with an accent, with a Francophone accent. So I always speak French to my parents, and in fact it feels very awkward speaking any other language with them. It feels quite unnatural. So at home we spoke French, but in Alaska and then in British Columbia, where we then next moved, at the time there were no French schools. So when I started going to kindergarten and to grade 1, there were no French schools, but my parents sent me to school in English. Not only in a sense because they had no choice, but also because this was the time in Canada when there was a big movement towards bilingualism. Because of course in Canada there's 2 large colonial languages, there's French and there's English, which used to exist in sort of 2 solitudes. And in the 60s and 70s there was a big movement to make it a truly bilingual country where people would try to learn both languages. So there was a great acceptance, at least on an ideological level, towards learning the other language. So I went to school in English, and then we moved to Ottawa, and then my parents joined the Foreign Service, and we moved to Costa Rica, to Spain, to Central America. So here I was speaking French at home in a Spanish-speaking country, but there was no notion that I would go to school in Spanish, so I went to school in English. So I was speaking French at home, going to school in English in a Spanish-speaking country. And then we moved to France. My parents were posted in France, and there we arrived mid-year, and more for practical reasons of the British school in Paris being more flexible. I went to school, even in France, I went to school in English. And so my entire educational career was done in English. My entire familial history is of speaking French. And we, for a while, lived in countries where they spoke Spanish. Subsequently, my parents were posted to Spain, and I spent 4 summers with them and traveled around Spain. So the circumstances of my life have made that I speak French, English, and Spanish, not as well as I do French and English, but quite well.
So when you went to school in English, did you have a grasp of English before you started school, or did you learn English at school?
You know, I don't ever remember not speaking English. So, you know, when you're that young, kindergarten, or even, I think I did preschool, so I must have been 4 or 5. You know, I don't ever remember not speaking English, and I don't ever remember learning French. So obviously, at that young age, you are making various sounds, various grunts that get you something. And I guess I never realized that the grunts I pronounced at home and the grunts I made at school were of a different nature. They were just various grunts. So I said, I don't ever remember not speaking both of those languages. Spanish, I do remember a little bit later, because that was more exterior to the educational experience. It was less of a formal one. I do remember learning details of English spelling. So I remember in Costa Rica learning the teacher, and it was a very visual memory of the teacher saying there's the word in and there's the word to. Those are two separate words, but you can actually join them into the word into. And I remember that blew my mind. I thought that was so amazing, the plasticity of language, that you could meld words together. Germans must revel in that because they have these incredibly long words.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember it being really cool that those two words could be joined together. So that has less to do with a specific language and more just the idea of discovering that language was this sort of elastic thing that you could play with. And it happened to be in English because I was going to school in English.
You can join all the grunts together and they make new bigger grunts.
New bigger grunts, exactly.
So did you learn Spanish then more through sort of immersion in the culture? Was that a very different experience of learning a language to English?
It was, because whereas when you learn a language in school, you tend to learn it in a very structured way. So you learn grammar, you learn syntax. When you learn it on the street, which in a sense is how I learned it, you don't necessarily learn the language in such a structured way. So for example, Spanish is fabulously complicated in terms of its verbs. There's the subjunctive, which has largely disappeared in English. It's just, you really have to learn your verbs. And so those I often make mistakes. I don't make mistakes with vocabulary because nouns are easy to learn. After all, the world is full of objects. They have names. It's very easy to pick up nouns, but verbs and accords are a bit more complicated. So those I'm not quite up to speed when it comes to every single, the conditional, I get those mixed up in Spanish, but I have a good sound knowledge. I can get by very easily in Spanish, very confidently, but I make mistakes. But the trick, in fact, I've learned in learning languages is you don't worry about mistakes. People who appreciate that you make the effort and they understand you, they're fine. That you make a fantastic number of mistakes, they find charming, and your bad accent, they find charming, but they appreciate that you're making the effort to speak their language. So whenever I speak Spanish, I don't worry about that.
Yeah.
And just barrel through and I just, I speak it. And I said the one I make mistakes is the things that I failed to learn in a classroom because I never took Spanish in a classroom. I just learned it from fellow kids and from traveling around Spain.
Do you think your experience then of living in Spanish-speaking countries was enhanced by being able to also speak the local language? Because obviously you didn't need to at home and you didn't need to at school, but something about being able to immerse yourself in the community would have been why you needed Spanish too.
Yeah, speaking a language, this is a cliche here, but speaking a language opens doors to a remarkable extent. So speaking English, of course, it being truly a world language spoken everywhere, means you can access local knowledge that otherwise be closed to you. Speaking Spanish is also very useful. Spain is one of the great cultures of Europe, but of course is spoken all through Central and South America and Mexico. Speaking French, opens certain countries of Europe, France, parts of Belgium, parts of Switzerland, parts of Africa. And I've noticed when I've traveled in countries, I traveled at one point through Indonesia, and I do not speak in Bahasa. I don't speak the local language. And I remember that really closes things down. You're really on the outside now, and you need someone who speaks your language, usually English, to help you through. But it really means a lot is close to you. And places, let's say like China, where you can't make head or tails of the writing, it makes it even more difficult. Because at least if something is written in Roman letters, you can learn to recognize certain things like street or, which bathroom to go to. I remember vividly going to being in Spain in the Basque country, and Basque is a very different language. Finno-Ugric, it's related to they classify it with Finnish, and one of these fantastically incomprehensible languages. I remember going to the toilet in a bar, and it was written men and women, but it was written in Basque. So I had no idea which door I should go through. So, if you don't speak a language at all, it inhibits that experience of the country and the culture, and you have to rely on the kindness of people who speak your language. And if your language happens to be English, then you're in luck. If you're a Finnish traveler, you're a bit out of luck because very few people will speak Finnish, and so it makes it much more opaque an experience.
Yeah, I found that exact thing in China actually. I needed to get a taxi by myself, and as you said, I didn't understand the signs either. So I had to get my friend who was living in China to write down for me on a piece of paper what I needed to say to the taxi driver to get where I needed. And it was a real, oh my goodness, I don't know how to speak to this person. So yeah, I totally get that one. Um, as an adult, you've traveled in many places, I believe Mexico, South America, Iran, Turkey, India, probably even more. Um, what was your experience of languages during your travels? Did you find yourself using languages or picking up any new language skills?
Absolutely. I mean, in South America, where Spanish is very varied, there's a lot of accents, and nonetheless, if you speak Spanish, it opens up the whole country to you. You move much more fluidly. You can get by, and people are much more pleased to see you because you don't feel like a native to them, but they feel they can relate to you more. They figure, oh, this gringo has somehow learned our language. That's good. It's a sign of respect in a sense. Not that it's disrespectful not to speak a language. You're not going to speak the hundreds of languages this world has produced, but it just means that they feel closer to you, and it just makes it much more easier. Even just in terms of getting a coffee, getting a breakfast, asking a direction, it just means you can get by much more easily. Also, for example, India. What's interesting about India, unlike China, is in India, nearly anyone with any level of education will speak English. First of all, there's some Indians for whom English is their native language, but there are hundreds of millions of Indians who speak, their native language is one of the dozens and dozens of native languages of India, but they also speak English. And that means you can travel through the whole country, and the country is remarkably accessible. They speak religions that are, Hinduism, just to take one example, Jainism. These are religions that are not native to the West or to North America, but you can go there, and because they speak English, you can suddenly access that Hindu part of them, or that Jain part of them, or that Muslim part of them, or that Buddhist part of them, or just their little regional part of them you can access because they're sharing your language. So India, is a vast country, ancient, dozens of cultures. It's a fascinating country. It is remarkably accessible because, as a result of colonialism, they have adopted English as one of their own languages, and many, hundreds of millions of Indians speak, very good English, or certainly at the very least rudimentary English, and that means that the door is flung wide open, and so it makes it a much more accessible country than we just gave the example of China, which is equally vast and impressive a country, but because the language is so inaccessible to Westerners, it's very hard to pick up Chinese. Like even in someone who doesn't speak any Spanish, if they backpack around South America, they will very quickly pick up enough to ask favors, to ask directions. They will get enough. You just can't do that in China. It's just such a difficult language and so you're basically reduced to, it's sort of infantilizing when you don't speak a language at all. You're like a little child needing directions and help everywhere. So it's made travel, and at a deeper level too, when you have a common language, whether you speak the native language or they speak an international language, you can suddenly get insights into local culture that you can't if you're on the outside looking in, like a cat looking at a fishbowl.
Yeah, that's a very interesting take on it. The fact that somewhere like India with so many languages, actually, because they have English as a common language, you get to experience you can experience all the different parts of that culture as well. Why did you decide to do quite so much traveling?
Well, that was a habit that, my parents working for the Foreign Service, being diplomats, we would move every 3-4 years, which was sometimes kind of difficult because you lose all your friends, and first day at a new school when you're the new kid is not at all pleasant, but it's very enriching. You see, I lived as a child, I vividly remember living in Costa Rica and in France, and then later on a bit in Mexico and Spain. And the world's an incredibly varied, beautiful place. There's so many ways that we are as a species, the way we dress, the way we eat, the way we look, the way we are as social beings, the way we build buildings, the way we build our cities, our geographies. It's just, I found it intoxicatingly beautiful. So some of my great experiences have been of travel. Traveling through Turkey, for example, which is at this confluence of all these civilizations, East and West, Asia and Europe. It's a Muslim state, but, not recently, but largely secular because of Ataturk. Noah's Ark landed in Turkey. The originator of Santa Claus was a bishop in Turkey.
It
There's
was,
just
yeah.
so much in Turkey that I just remember it being such being in your 20s when you're carefree, having all your belongings in a little backpack. To travel the world was absolutely thrilling. I still love it now. I'm 57 and I still love traveling because it's like a restaurant with an infinite menu. There's so much to savor that I've always liked it. So my parents did it professionally. And then when I grew up, I just kept on doing it myself. Periodically, I'd go for these 6-month jaunts, twice to India, in South America. Then my parents later on, when I was in my 20s, they were posted in Paris yet again. They had 3 postings in Paris. Well, one time I came to visit for a few months. I ended up staying 4 years, traveling around Europe. So yeah, it's a thing I've kept doing. In fact, that's one thing I hate about this damn pandemic, of course, is there's the human suffering, but I can't see the world anymore. My partner and I and our children haven't traveled in the last year and a half because of this pandemic. It'd be irresponsible to travel, so we don't. But I miss that. I miss seeing the world.
Yeah, and then you have to do all your interviews via Zoom and that kind of thing. So you've been an author for many years now, and your books are set in varying locations. So, for example, The High Mountains of Portugal is obviously set in Portugal, and Life of Pi originates in India. Has your background in travel and languages experienced or helped your writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the cliches of writing is write what you know about. And having traveled, having seen so many different stages around the world, it just seemed natural to write my stories on some of these different stages. And you have to be careful with that, of course. There's that debate about voice appropriation. You don't want to, as an empowered white male, I do not want to be stealing the voice of someone who's disempowered. But as it happens, I've never done that. Life of Pi, as you said, starts in India. Indian literature is done very, very well. But it felt natural to me to be in a place as intoxicatingly varied as India. It was very stimulating. And I think it's a very common experience with Westerners. They go to India and they sort of go local. They suddenly think they're Hindus or whatever. They take up yoga, they take up vegetarianism. It's a country that lends itself very much to suddenly feeling alive and you want to renew yourself. So backpacking around India, I thought up this story of Life of Pi. And that kind of a story lends itself. So, Pi has many identities. He practices 3 religions. He's a Hindu, a Muslim, and a Christian. That kind of multiplicity of identity lends itself to India because it is itself a country with many, many identities. So it was natural to set it there. Portugal was sort of on the, first, Portugal is a lovely little country, tiny little country in Europe, but had at one point one of the greatest colonial empires. They had colonies in India, they had, of course, Brazil, they had colonies in Africa, Angola, and Mozambique. So small country that traveled the world because it faced the ocean. They traveled the oceans of the world, and there's something that's small yet vast about Portugal, and a very multicultural country. Another thing, speaking of languages, it's very surprising the difference between Spain and Portugal. You go to Lisbon, and there's great little Chinese restaurants and great Indian restaurants, and it's because after decolonization, you had people from Macau who came back to Portugal and they opened up Chinese restaurants. You have people from India, from Diu and Goa, who came back to Portugal, opened up Indian restaurants. So it's natural for me to sort of not just want to write about what's here and now, write about Saskatchewan. I like using what's far away to see better close up. It's all a question of trying to tell something that speaks of the truth of being human. So it's a question with the metaphors that you use. And I just find that stories set afar, in fact, bring me closer to what it means to being human. And so traveling and language has been very useful in that way of seeing myself through the other.
Would you say perhaps even the travel inspired you to want to write, or did you already have that interest in writing?
I think it's a bit of both. It's hard to see. I mean, I've only had my experience of life, so I don't know. For sure, I think traveling enriched uh, my point of view. Not that you have to, let's not overrate that. William Faulkner from Mississippi, never traveled much until late in life. He's still a great world writer. So it's a question of, I think, personality and openness. You can travel the world and still be close-minded. I mean, for example, British colonialism. The British spread throughout the world, set up their empire. Those who were in the back of beyond weren't necessarily open to the back of beyond. They thought it was the back of beyond. They all wanted to be back in England. So they lived abroad, but they didn't necessarily were open to what they saw and what they lived. They imposed their colonial structure. So it has to do with disposition, I think. I think traveling will tend to open your mind. I mean, your luck of living in Europe, of course, is you have like dozens of cultures side by side. Often there's a fair bit of friction, but you can very quickly, short little hop, and you're in this completely different country where they speak a different language, practice a different religion, have a different architecture, different way of eating. It's dizzying. So I forgot your question, but
it was whether traveling inspired a love of writing in you, or whether,
you said the high mountains of Portugal. Portugal was the first country I traveled to on my own. Until then, I traveled with my parents, but I think I was 19 or 20. It was the first time I landed in Lisbon with my little backpack, and I sort of nervously started poking around the country. And there was something about that was really like, because there's a big difference between traveling in a group, like, a bunch of people after university in England traveling around, or between that gap year, the famous gap year. If you're traveling in a group, that's also really thrilling, but you're spending a lot of time in your little social dynamic of your little group. If you travel alone, you're a lone element, and it's you and that country, and you really interact with it at a much deeper level. So Portugal was the first time I traveled on my own, and it stayed with me. Hence why, 30 years later, I wrote The High Mountains of Portugal. Life of Pi was directly the result of going to India. I happened to be following this girl, and it didn't work out with the girl, but it worked out with India. I fell in love with India, and I returned for another 6-month trip, and that's when I started writing Life of Pi. So sometimes stories have been brought to me by foreign travel. Not always. My novel Self wasn't. My next novel, called Son of Nobody, was inspired by Homer's Iliad. Now, as it happened, I traveled through Greece and Turkey extensively, but that story was mainly brought by reading Homer's Iliad. This time it was a book. Now, once again, a book set far away that inspired me, but it wasn't directly from travel. But yes, travel has definitely always nourished my imagination that expresses itself in my books.
Yeah. You write in English. Do you primarily read in English? If you're reading a novel yourself, do you prefer to read in English, or have you read novels in other languages? For example, have you read a novel in Spanish?
Yeah, I've definitely read in French. I read lots in French when I was young. When I was in French, I read him. Obviously, if something was in French, I wasn't going to read Alexandre Dumas in English. It'd be ridiculous. I read Dumas in French.
Yeah.
I read, all the French writers I read, Maupassant, Balzac. I read all of those in French. But sometimes I have no choice. I love the Russians. So all the Russians that I've read, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Gogol, all of those I've read in English because I have no choice. I don't speak Russian at all.
Yeah.
I don't speak Italian either. So I love Dante. I love the Divine Comedy. I don't speak Italian, so I've read it in good translations. There it comes down to translations. I've read it in wonderful translations. Dante, for example, a wonderful translation by an American poet named John Ciardi. So when I can, I read in the local language. So anything in English and French, I read in English and French. Spanish, no, because Spanish, like English, is spoken in so many different languages. I can read articles in English, like in Spanish, like a newspaper article, I can get by. But, Garcia Marquez, forget it. It's too much of a local Spanish it's just too plodding. I end up reading word by word. Yeah. It's too plodding. So, I'll have read that in English. But when I can, English and French, I read in the local language, and otherwise I have to rely on translation.
Do you think when learning a language, that reading in that language would help you pick up that language and perhaps help you get better at writing in a second language?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you stay oral, that's all you can do. You stay at oral. When you read, see, when you speak, I mean, spoken language is rarely correct language in the sense when we speak,
Mhm.
we never finish our sentences. We'll make little mistakes, but it doesn't matter. We're getting our, it's done so spontaneously speaking that we accept a higher level of mistakes. Once you write something down, unless you really don't care about it, or unless you're a highfalutin literary writer and you're really doing stream of consciousness, written language is more structured, right?
Yeah.
You have full sentences with punctuation, the syntax is correct, you try to have all the grammar correct. And so if you read that, you're seeing proper English, Spanish, Chinese, Portuguese, whatever. And so, yes, it does help you understand it better because you see the structure of language better. And also, when we speak, we tend to use more regular vocabulary, more mundane vocabulary. Once you start writing, especially if it's literary, if you're reading a story, the vocabulary tends to be richer, slightly more exotic. So if you read something, you will tend to also pick up vocabulary along the way. Whereas in spoken language, we tend to just want to communicate, so we use more cliches when we speak, and we use more ordinary vocabulary. So there's definitely something enriching about reading. You have to do the easy thing to start is simple, a newspaper article, for
Mhm.
example. And then you can move to short story, and eventually you may get to poetry, highly arcane use of language.
Writing novels, as you do, is obviously a big writing task. Are there smaller writing tasks, so smaller steps, say, that somebody learning a second language could do to work up to writing a bigger piece, particularly if they were doing it to practice the language?
Well, the obvious one to me would be like emails or letters.
Mm-hmm.
Occasionally, for example, just recently, Mexican photographer out of the blue contacted me saying, listen, I'm doing a photographic project and I'd like some writers to comment on my photographs. Just could be very short, but could you comment on my photographs? And he just plucked me out of the ether, asking me to do it. And so because I was just writing to him, I replied to him in Spanish. Now, I'm sure I made mistakes. I kind of looked at Google Translate, but I'm sure but it was a pleasure writing in Spanish. Um, and so he wrote back in Spanish and he was delighted. It's funny, he wanted to practice his English on me. I wanted to practice my Spanish on him. But for things like that, where it's very personal and it's just to one person, yeah, that's a great practice. Because, if you're writing a letter to someone, they're not going to care particularly if you make a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have to have someone who speaks that language, of course, like a pen pal, or in this case, I said it was a Mexican photographer. So for things like that, I will write in Spanish, because it doesn't matter if you make mistakes. In my case, when I write to my parents emails, I always write in French. I never write in English. So yeah, things like that is a good practice. Also, it's just good practice, maybe just writing anything like a little diary entry just for
Mm-hmm.
yourself. And obviously, when you first start, it's really awkward because every language has a kind of a spirit to it. I mean, every language can say what needs to be said, right? This idea that the Inuit have 47 different words for snow is possibly true, but it's a banality. If you put someone from Africa, if you sent them up to the high north long enough, that person would eventually find 47 different ways to describe conditions of snow. An English skier, will find all the ways to describe the skiing conditions in the snow. So any language can do what it needs to do given time. Nonetheless, every language I've found has a kind of spirit to it, just a sort of a feel to it. And it's interesting to explore that. And if you do it by writing, you discover that in a different way than just by speaking. One of the obvious, for example, a difference between English and French, this is a very well-known one, is levels of politeness. In French, as indeed in Spanish and in German, in French you have tu, which in Old English was thou, and you have vous, which would be you. And so vous in French is used either to someone who's older or someone whom you don't know. You wouldn't say thou. You wouldn't use that intimate because you don't know them. So you say vous to you, even if it's one person, because vous, of course, is they, is the plural. they. But you say vous to express politeness, distance. And tu would be intimacy. Now in English, we've lost that. It used to be that we had thou. Hemingway, in one of his novels, the one set in Spain, I'm just blanked out. Anyway, the one set in Spain, he reuses thou. The characters, when they're intimate, say thou. When they're more formal with each other, they use you. We've lost that in English, which is not a bad thing. But when you speak another language, you sort of realize, oh, there is that distinction there, and it makes you think about levels of formality. And it's sometimes the question that arises in translation. So, for example, when Life of Pi was translated into French, in English, you have you have 1,000 yous. Well, once you translate into English, French, or German, you have to decide, well, wait a second, is this you a vous or a tu? So in Life of Pi, at one point, Pi, who's 16 years old, is being interrogated by these older Japanese investigators. So they are older and they were foreign. So normally, you know, he would call them vous, and they would call him tu because he's younger. But because he's been through a lot and they're wanting something from him and they want to show deference, we had to sort of say, well, do they call him tu or vous? And we initially said, no, even though he's 16 and they're older, they will call him vous. They'll use the more formal one. So you have these little nuances that foreign languages bring to you that don't necessarily apply. I said in English, there's no choice. Unless you want to be quaint, you can start using thou, but most people will be puzzled by it. But none introduces these categories of approach that are kind of interesting to play with, and that can renew the language. Who's to say that we won't soon start reusing thou again to create that distinction that has been lost in English? So speaking another language, what I found it does is that it allows you to open doors when you travel, but we can't be traveling our entire lives. What it actually does is that renews our own language. And English is a perfect example of that, of course. English being spoken, English started in this dank little island in the north of Europe, but by the happenstance of history, you know, British colonialism and then American imperialism is spoken the world over, which means English has been infused by all these foreign languages. So it has a dizzying vocabulary. There's such a huge vocabulary to English, which is quite intoxicating. And that's because English, like a sponge, absorbed other languages. And that's typical of English, in fact. It absorbed other words, and it really has enriched the English language. I find speaking in a language that kind of done that. Sometimes when I'm writing and I'm a little bit stuck, it'll happen regularly. I say, oh, how do you say that in English? Because I know the French word. I know the French word. Like, for example, there's a wonderful French word called entendement. Entendement is like a sort of a getting along. When you grok someone, that's an old science fiction novel. But, you know, entendement means you just get along. And there's no quite simple word that I can think of in English like that. I have to think about it. Another word is swear words. English languages swear in different ways. In Quebec, in French Quebec, swear words tend to be of religious origin. Catholic religion words are used as swear words. In English, of course, it's mainly sexual words. There's the famous one that starts with F. We will not say it. But it's interesting. In French, you don't have that word, which is why it's such a powerful word in other language, because you can't say that famous F one in French. There's just no single word as powerful as that one in English. So that's another thing. You discover that swear words are different from language. So it renews your sense of your own languages when you discover other ones. It can change your approach to yours. As a writer, it pushes you. It pushes you, I think, more to renew your own language and not sit with what you already have, but to take it on and renew it.
You've described your early writing at university as dreadful. What do you think was so dreadful about it, and how have you gone from that point to writing best-selling novels now?
Well, it has to do just with maturity. The first thing I ever wrote was a play, and it was bad as a play because I don't know how to write plays. Even now as a grown-up, moving plot strictly through dialogue is a trick that playwrights have, and one that I don't have. But it's all just to do with emotional maturity, when certainly I, as a 19-year-old, was quite immature. I knew nothing about life. I had a certain intellectual baggage. I'd gone through school. I was in second year university. I had all those things that teachers had taught me, but I had no sort of visceral existential experience of life. So my play was just sort of farcically immature. And so my writing improved simply by dint of writing. Keep on writing. You can't play the clarinet unless you actually play it every day. You have to practice it. But also just experience of life, traveling, meeting people, falling in love, falling out of love, being hurt, hurting other people. All these experiences of life soften you, harden you, um, make you see further, deeper, and you start slowly getting better. So I got better by writing. I became technically better, although I still feel that I'm an amateur, sort of don't know what I'm doing. And that's good. You want to be spontaneous. You don't want to know everything you're doing because then it becomes dull. And then just by sort of emotional maturing, you start getting a better sense of what it means to be alive. It's not just an intellectual experience, it's primarily an emotional experience.
So if someone writes something they're not happy with, it doesn't mean they're a terrible writer. They just need some experience and some practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could be a terrible writer in the sense that you're trying to write a sonnet, but you have no idea how a sonnet works, or a haiku. It could be a technical restriction. But if you're just writing, let's say, a short story, a prose story, most people who've gone to school, it's not even a question of bad grammar and bad syntax. Jeffrey Archer, the English, novelist, is apparently quite a terrible. Here, Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code. You read a page of Dan Brown, there are so many cliches. They're astonishing. But Dan Brown has a terrific sense of plot. And what I loved about the Da Vinci Code, what some pretentious writers loved hating, what I loved about the Da Vinci Code is that it was profoundly a feminist novel. It was all about how the Catholic Church is anti-feminist. So I love that he had a feminist agenda with the Da Vinci Code. And you have to take something for what it aims to be. Dan Brown does not aim to be Shakespeare. He aims to tell a story, and in terms of the Da Vinci Code, he had a sort of a feminist agenda. So I love the Da Vinci Code. Did I think it deserved, the Pulitzer Prize? No, but that's a stupid way of approaching it. You have to take it for what it is. So it could be that something that is written that isn't good because it isn't really what it aims to be. Often I find writers think what they've written is one thing, but in fact it's something else. They haven't quite realized that they're not having the effect on the reader that they want to have. So they have to, as a writer, you have to be a writer, but you also have to be a reader. You have to be a reader. You have to sort of see what you've written as if you had not written it, but you were a reader. And you have to sort of see, well, is this saying what it aims to say? And that has more technical stuff. But no, it's not necessarily, it could be very good, but not in the way that you intend. So you have to know what you're trying to write, and it has to ring true. So you can write a Western or a murder mystery, whatever. Nothing is better than anything else. If you're telling a story, you're telling a story. You just have to be aware of what you're trying to say and who it's for.
Yeah, I guess there's a big difference between writing for entertainment and writing for something to be grammatically correct. I mean, a story is a story.
Ideally, everything is entertaining. They often say that academic, and I remember reading sometimes in part of research for my own novels, reading academic things written by academics. So for example, my next novel is inspired by Homer's Iliad. So in doing my research on Homer's Iliad, I've read here and there academic articles. Now those can be fairly deadening because there's an aim to convey information, and that information is accurate and backed up, which means that sometimes it's fairly deadening. That's kind of a pity, but I still learned a lot from them. But once you're telling a story, you want to have a combination of, yes, both being entertaining, but not solely that. That is the problem. If you're too entertaining, and going back to Dan Brown, I don't know why we're picking on Dan Brown here. Da Vinci Code, as I said, is narratively phenomenal. But precisely because of that, you have to, if you're on a train that's really powerful, it's great being on a train, but where are you going? The problem with Dan Brown, and I challenge most people who've read Dan Brown, is try to remember, how did it end? What was the ending? Most stories that are too narratively driven disappoint in their destination. And so the trick I find with a really good story, what would be called literature, it is of course entertaining. There's no reason to read a boring novel. but it has to be both entertaining and enlightening. You have to, the purpose of writing a book is you get somewhere that changes the reader. So it's not a question of driving there fast. It has to, yes, you want to drive there at a good clip so people aren't bored, but you want to get somewhere. You want to be transformed. So, you know, anyone who's read Moby Dick or, you know, or even Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a wonderful example. It's entertaining, but Harry Potter changes. It's a dramatic story. You get somewhere. So that's the balance I always try to achieve in writing, is both entertaining, but making your reader think, changing them somehow. And I think that, for example, was the appeal of Life of Pi for a lot of readers. It was both an entertaining story of a boy surviving on a lifeboat with a tiger, but then when you get to the end, you realize there's something completely else happening here. There was some sort of philosophical conundrum about, you know, how do we experience reality? How do we talk about it? You know, so there was something else happening there that made the reader think, and I think that's what made the novel stick with readers.
So, talking of Life of Pi and how you decided to tell that story, for the most part, it's told from the perspective of the main character, Pi, and for a large portion of the novel, Pi finds himself essentially alone, at least in terms of human company, because he's on a life raft with a zebra, an orangutan, a hyena, and a tiger. Later on, just the tiger for obvious reasons. So therefore, there's not much opportunity for conversation to make it into that story, but there's plenty in the writing to engage the reader through that whole period. Why did you decide to write it in the first person, and what do you think that narrative style brings to this novel?
Well, the advantage of first-person narrative is that it gives a certain sense of intimacy and of immediacy. I mean, after all, with the I voice, you as the reader are with the narrator. It's like you're in a car and the narrator's driver and you're right next to him or her, seeing out the same window. So there's a certain immediacy, a certain intimacy. Now, the problem with that, of course, is also a limitation, is you don't get a great sense of perspective. So it lends itself well to stories that are intimate. So Life of Pi, story of a castaway, it struck me right away as fairly pointless having an omniscient perspective, because there's not much to look at with that omniscient perspective. It's just a kid on a lifeboat with a tiger. So having a camera hovering above that would get kind of dull. I was more interested in how Pi took to what was happening to him. So the advantage of a first person is intimacy. The advantage of third person narrative is you do get sweep, you get perspective. You can, you know, from an omniscient perspective, you can delve into the thoughts of many characters. So you can have a wider stage with an omniscient third person narration. I kind of like the intimacy that Pi of a first person voice with Life of Pi. So it depends on the kind of narrative you want to use, whether you use first person or third person or even second person. Occasionally people use.
At the end, spoiler alert, when Pi is rescued, he tells the Japanese authorities two stories. So one being the story that the reader's just been told, but the other being one where the animals are replaced by human characters. So for example, the orangutan in the first story is his mother in the second story. Arguably, logically, perhaps that's more likely to be Pi's real story, we don't know. But why did you decide to tell the first story in so much more detail?
Well, because the point I wanted to make with Life of Pi is that we're not just computers taking in facts, that life is largely a personal, interpretative experience. Life isn't what it is, life is how you take it. Now, certain basic facts are inarguable. You know, where you live, the languages you speak, things that might happen to you. If you get hit by a bus, there's no arguing away that you were hit by a bus. But what is subject to basically infinite freedom is how you interpret what happens to you. And it's in that interpretation that where life actually lies. And so, to me, Life of Pi was a defense of the imagination, of how it's an essential tool to understanding life. And if you ban the imagination too much, you essentially ban all the richness of life. And so in that defense fits art. Art, you know, the painter who draws a painting, the musician does a song. These are all just emanations of someone's subjectivity, of how they feel. And you can dismiss that saying, well, who cares about this artist or this or that? But ultimately, yes, what he or she feels may matter to you because it may influence how you feel. And you want to feel more and more and more. And to feel more and more and more, you need to use your imagination. You need to use facts as sort of the ground upon which that you build the building of your life. And so that needs imaginative wealth, and art builds upon that, and so does, as it happens, religion. Now, I'm from a completely secular background. My parents very early on replaced religion with art. My parents grew up in the 60s in Quebec, where there was a turning back at the back on the Catholic Church. They were fiercely secular people, my parents. They still are. So they replaced religion with art. If you want to understand life, read great novels, go to museums, listen to great music. That's the way, and that's totally valid. But in my 30s, when I was traveling through India, where religion is still very present and is still very much a mainstream experience, which it is no longer in Canada and in England. You know, there are some people who still go to church in England and are still very much centered on whatever religion they practice, but mainstream culture is largely secular culture. And I have no problems with that, of course. It allowed science to exist, it allowed feminism to arise and all that. But it has done damage, I think, to the imagination. A hardcore scientific secular approach tends to be suspicious of the imagination. So with Life of Pi, I want to say, hey, you can interpret things in a very flat way, that what happened to Pi was just this horrible man's inhumanity to man kind of story. Or maybe something else happened, and you can't tell. The only witness to what happened was Pi. Mm. So which story do you want to believe? What difference does it make to you? With this kid that he crossed the Pacific with animals or with humans, what difference does it make to you? Which do you want to believe? So to me, it was a defense of a grand vision of faith. You're not just a computer. We're all dream machines. And you want to dream more and more. Not crazy dreams, not dreams that are violent, either to yourself or to others. You don't want extremism. But it's like, the simplest analogy is, do you want to tell the children right from the start that Santa Claus doesn't exist?
No.
You want your little kid to believe in Santa Claus for a couple of years because it's wonderful. And then he or she grows up. They discover that Santa Claus is just mommy and daddy going to the local store. For a while, and in a sense, in a grand way, we want life to be like that. We want to believe in grander, more metaphorically thick Santa Clauses. We want to believe more. Because there's no triumph, it strikes me, to get to the end of your life and say to yourself, I've believed in very little. I've only believed in the hardcore truth. But you want to believe in things. I mean, love, for example, is an imaginative act. There's no particular reason to love one person over another. It doesn't increase your chances of reproduction, loving one particular person over another. You might as well just be like animals that basically mate with whatever's around. But we don't want to be like that. It's that imaginative charge that love brings to us that makes life rich. So in telling two stories based on the same facts, I wanted to tell people, hey, believe the better story. At one point, Pi, at the end of the novel, asks the interrogators, which is the better story? He doesn't say which is the true story, because factual truth at one point is irrelevant. It's just one element of something. Is a symphony true? Is Beethoven's Sixth true? Is a Picasso painting true? It's an odd way to put it. It's true in some way. It's obviously his subjective reaction to life, Picasso and Beethoven. But the factual truth of it is irrelevant. How Beethoven came to compose his symphony, why Picasso painted this particular painting in this way, is only a small part of the story. The bigger part is, how does it feel to you? How do you feel when you listen to Beethoven? How do you feel when you look at a Picasso? How do you feel when you read the monotonous, mesmerizing prose of Virginia Woolf? How do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel? That's what you want to explore. And that goes way beyond factual truth. So in Life of Pi, I wanted to defend that and say, interpret life as richly as you can. It's not about believing in religions if you don't want to, but hey, no real harm. If you use Buddha or Allah or Jesus in a way to be a better human being, if it just enriches then why not? It's exactly like reading a novel and being changed by it. It's enriched your life and you've done no harm, so it's a good thing. So in Life of Pi, I wanted to defend the imagination, and so I gave one flat story, the one with humans, without animals, and one with animals. And I'm saying, well, which is richer? So Pi asks, which is the better story? And that's the key question of the novel, is which is the better story? And obviously it's a defense of a better story, one in which there is truth, but also a lot of imagination. It's in that alchemical combination of the two that you get a meaningful life.
When Pi asks that question, the authorities say they prefer the first story, don't they? They prefer the one with the animals, which is exactly Pi's point. So I guess in a way he's kind of saying, well, you're welcome. That's why I made it more interesting.
It's the younger investigator, Mr. Chiba, the younger one, who immediately jumps in and says, and the older one hesitates, but later on in his report, yes. But yeah, you're right. They initially come around to it. Because you know what? Either way doesn't answer the question they really have is, why did that ship sink?
Yeah.
They want to have a simple, factual question. And this side story is just a side story to them. It doesn't really matter to them. But then they both eventually come to realize that, hey, yeah, maybe he did survive with the tigers. You know what? We don't know. But we'll believe the one with the tiger.
On the subject of telling your own story and making your own story as you go along, would you say that embracing languages and travel and things like you have help that story develop? And you said earlier it opens doors, so perhaps creates more opportunities for your own story along the way.
Yeah, so one thing we talked about travel and language. One thing about moving around and traveling is I've read earlier on. I read a more diverse. Now this is now we're in 2021, but when I was younger, we didn't necessarily have foreign literatures as present in each country as we do now, maybe. So moving around meant that I read French writers that someone in Quebec or in Canada wouldn't necessarily have read at an early age. So I've read at a younger age more foreign literature, I think, than possibly a typical Canadian would have at the age I was. So that definitely enriched my sense of what language can do, what stories can do.
Yeah. So when you say you've read more foreign literature, you meant translated foreign literature? Or?
Well, as I said, in French, when I was living in Paris, I read both the French stuff that the local French were teaching their kids, because this is France and we want the French to learn our literature. These were not things that necessarily someone in Quebec would be reading, or in English Canada, certainly not. But I also read stuff that was just popular at the time. So, for example, there's a wonderful Italian writer named Dino Buzzati. His best-known novel is called The Tartar Steppes. It's a world masterpiece. Dino Buzzati has never made it as much as he should in North America. He's not a very well-known writer in North America. In France, I guess maybe because he's very well translated, or for whatever reason, Dino Buzzati was widely translated in France. So I, with my father, discovered Dino Buzzati at the same time, and we read tons of Dino Buzzati, his novels and his short stories. So this was from the Italian translated into French. I read those because they happened to be popular in France. If I'd grown up only in Quebec or only in English Canada, I doubt I would have discovered Dino Buzzati at that age.
Yeah, obviously translating a novel, you couldn't just use Google Translate. And as you were saying earlier, with French, there's so many different ways of addressing people. When Life of Pi was translated into French, did you have a lot of input into how that was written in French?
Well, as it happens, Life of Pi was translated into French by my parents.
Oh.
My parents are the translators of Life of Pi into French. So yes, I had very much translated it, and then I read it. Not only because it was French, so I read the translation, but it was my parents. So we had long discussions about it. Because what's fascinating about translation, the art of translation, is it has to be done correctly, and you have to do it word by word, which means all these nuances come up. I said the vous tu is a very obvious one. Also, what's funny about translation is mistakes come up. If you make a mistake in the original language, your translators will find it. So I vividly remember in my first book, a collection of short stories, in the title short story, The Facts Behind the Helsinki Rockamatios, takes place in Helsinki, it became clear to me, because my German translators pointed out, that I didn't know the meaning of the word gable. I think in the story at one point I describe a house and I use the word gable. And I guess my English editors never mentioned this, but my translator said, you know what, when we translate this, it doesn't make sense. You don't know what the word gable means. And I looked it up and I said, you're right, I don't know what the word, I thought it meant this, but it means that. And none of my English editor didn't catch that mistake.
Just took your word for it.
So in that particular case, the German translation is more correct than the English one. Also, I remember in Life of Pi, there was an ambiguity at one point. There's Pi is on his lifeboat, and there's a huge fish, a tiger shark. And I think at one point, I can't remember what it said, but it's something along the lines of it didn't move. And in English, it turns out there was no clear antecedent to it. It wasn't obvious what it referred to. Now, it was a question of immobility. Now, to me, obviously, it wasn't that the fish was immobile. The fish is obviously very slowly swimming, and it's Pi's lifeboat that was not moving because there was no wind at that moment. But my parents pointed out, it's not clear. They mistranslated. They thought the fish wasn't moving, and it's the lifeboat that slowly moved over the fish. When in fact, no, it's the fish that was swimming by underneath the immobile lifeboat. But the it wasn't clear, and that became only apparent when it was translated into French. So I had to tell all my foreign translators in the other language that Pi was translated into that, hey, the it refers to the lifeboat, not to the fish. So translation does that. It brings out those little, and then of course you have a completely different feel of a foreign language. If you're, so it was weird reading Life of Pi in French because I could see the story, but it was coming from a different medium. It was, English and Indian stories lend themselves because English is so part of Indian culture now. It feels natural reading Salman Rushdie, and it's set in India. It feels natural. Reading when it's written in French, to me, felt odd. That's only because I know India. It bothers me not at all to read a Russian story in English because I don't know Russia at all. But it just makes me realize how much is lost in translation, how much richer Tolstoy would be if I read Russian. But so it goes. You also gain a lot, obviously. And you have no choice. If you don't learn, you can't learn every language of the world. Necessarily, things will be lost, but they're also gained because you're reading these stories that you couldn't read otherwise.
Yeah, and at least people reading in French know that the shark was moving and the boat wasn't moving, so they'll completely understand everything. What traits does Pi have you given him that are useful life skills for anyone? I mean, he survives for months on a raft with the Bengal tiger, so he must have a few things going for him.
Well, he practices many religion, which means he's open and tolerant. He also grew up in a zoo with many animals, so he's open and tolerant about different ways of being as biological beings. In a funny way, I said he's multi-religious. One presumes that as an Indian citizen, he'd be multilingual. Living in a zoo, he's also very tolerant of different species. So it all connects to a fundamental openness. I think the fundamental characteristic of Pi as a character is that he's open and receptive to different ways of being, to different experiences. And that's a valuable skill for anyone. That's something I got from traveling and from speaking many languages, is understanding there's many ways of being, and it's all okay. It's all okay to be completely different. There's many ways of being, and we should accept that, and not only accept it, but find it as a source of wealth. We don't want to live in a homogeneous world where everyone is the same.
Life of Pi was adapted into an Oscar-winning film by Ang Lee. How is reading a book and watching a film a different experience in terms of how you absorb the story, and how does that influence the creative process behind those two things, do you think?
Well, I would say, like most people say when they've both seen the movie and read the book is better. Cinema is very powerful, but it's also it's kind of like a kidnapping. In a movie, you're provided with everything, with visuals, and if you don't get the emotional tone, you got the music to tell you. It's very kinetic, so it's a very powerful experience. But especially in commercial cinema, where they really want to kidnap you, it doesn't involve you as much. When you read a book, it's, as everyone will know, it's more of an effort. You have to decipher the language, you have to understand it, you have to make this little movie in your head. That involves you more, and we actually like that more. So despite the fact that there's no visual content to a novel immediately, there is one when you co-create the story. Because in fact, when you read a book, you're co-creating it. You're taking the words and then giving life to that story in your mind. That's a very empowering experience. So I think when you read a book, you really feel that. It takes longer too. It can take several weeks to read a long novel. It makes it yours, whereas a movie is like 2 hours. That's it.
Yeah.
Now, the wonder of Netflix and streaming services like that is you can have series that go on for years, and it feels more like Game of Thrones was to me very much like a novelistic feel. You really get into the story because it goes on forever.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not as involving. It's more of a flattening experience, cinema. Now it has its own, talent, its own aspects, but it's more of a kidnapping experience, I think. Whereas literature is a more quieter, more solitary. It goes deeper, I think. Hence why I love the movie. It was very interesting being involved in it in a peripheral way. But ultimately, I like the power of words because they ask you to participate, and everyone likes to participate. No one likes not to be asked to participate.
Yeah, actually, when I was at uni, I actually wrote my dissertation on adaptation because I find it interesting how a novel can be so detailed, and then a film of the same novel can come out and then them kind of be two completely different things.
Well, different strengths. Language doesn't have words. Don't have any visual power. It's very hard to describe an image with words. An image does it instantly, whereas words are very good at exploring nuances of feelings. Words are very good at exploring thoughts. You can write philosophy. You can't visualize philosophy. You need the honing skills of language and its minute little words to really go into the details of a thought. But you can't describe an image. So they have different strengths and talents, and sometimes in an adaptation, the strength of one is lost on the other. So, for example, the sinking of the ship in Life of Pi I did with 3 words: the ship sank.
Yeah.
It was much more powerful in the movie because, hey, an image of the ship sinking is very powerful.
It actually sank, yeah. If you were to recommend a book to somebody learning English or even just trying to improve their English and wanting to read something, what kind of thing do you think you'd recommend them?
The first one I sent Stephen Harper was a book called The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy. It's a novella, maybe 70, 80 pages. It's light, entertaining, but also really profound about how Ivan Ilyich comes to die, his approach to death and how people around him deal with them. It's light and deep and heavy. It's a fantastic book. I mean, Tolstoy is a genius. That's a perfect example to show you what the written word can do. You cannot read The Death of Ivan Ilyich and not somehow be a better human being after that. And it doesn't matter where you're from. This is, set in provincial Russia in the 19th century. You can be a Tuareg, in the desert. You can be an Inuit up far north. You read that, it'll change you. That's a perfect example of what the written word could do.
I haven't actually read that one. That'll have to be next on my list. So thank you so much for speaking to me. It's really interesting to meet the person behind a book and get the insights into the experiences that go into creating a novel. So thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to your next book coming out.
Thank you very much, Lauren.